After reading this module, you should be able to understand the features of an interest rate swap and its variance, understand the features of a currency swap and its variant, differentiate between pure swaps and engineered swaps, know the concept of equity swap, assess risk in swaps. Swaps are basically an extension of the conventional swaps in the forex market, where currency dealers simultaneously sell and buy foreign currency for different maturities. Similarly, derivative swap product involves exchange of interest or foreign currency exposure or a combination of both by two or more corporate borrowers or corporate and the bank. It may not necessarily involve the legal swapping of actual debts, but an agreement is made to exchange cash flows under a particular loan. A swap can thus be defined as a financial transaction in which two counterparties agree to exchange streams of payments or cash flows over a time. Features of an interest rate swap and its variants. Interest rate swaps. An interest rate swap is a contract which commits two counterparties to exchange over an agreed period two streams of interest payments, each calculated using a different interest rate index but applied to a common notional principal amount. For instance, assume that two companies, namely Alpha and Beta, have entered into a swap agreement. Under it, Alpha committed to pay Beta a stream of semi-annual payments calculated using a long-term US dollar interest rate over a period of 3 years. In exchange, Beta committed to pay a counter stream of interest payments calculated using 6 months US dollar LIBOR. This transaction essentially involves exchange of fixed rate interest for floating rate interest in the same currency, calculated by the reference to an agreed notional amount of principal between the two parties. The stream of interest paid by Alpha will consist of equal interest amounts calculated at the prescribed fixed rate and is known in advance. Third, opposite to this, the 6 months LIBOR used to calculate interest payments of Beta is applicable only for 6 months, as once in every 6 months LIBOR rates is reset, there would be as many dissimilar payments. Hence, in the case of Beta, it is the first 6 months interest amount only is known in advance. The swap rate, that is the fixed rate, is quoted as a spread over the appropriate maturity current option treasury. Payments on floating sides are usually made flat, that is with no spread on the index rate. Whenever the number of payments to be exchanged through a swap differs between the parties, like in the current example, the normal practice is to split the less frequent payments or combine the more frequent payments so as to ensure that there are an equal number of payments. This facilitates netting of payments. principal amount is exclusively meant for calculating interest streams to be exchanged. At no points of time is principal amount physically exchanged. In effect, the counterparties to an interest rate swap aim to obtain an arbitrage advantage by drawing down the funds in the market where they have the greater relative cost advantage and subsequently entering into an interest rate swap to convert the cost of funds so raised to their advantage from fixed to floating or other way around. Variants of interest rate swaps. The first one is fixed for floating rate swaps. It is also known as plain vanilla swap. It involves fixed for floating or floating to fixed exchange of interest rates on same currency. In case of fixed rate, there is no interest payment but repayment is made at maturity. The next is floating for floating rate swaps. It involves floating for floating only. It means both the legs are floating. The next is fixed for fixed rate swaps. It is suitable when cash flows of a firm are very much volatile in nature. It means when cash flows of a firm are either higher or lower than the average cash flows at a particular season. In this case, firm will pay a fixed amount to a swap dealer if cash flows are higher or lower. In consideration to this, swap dealer will also pay the fixed amount to the firm if cash flows are lower or higher. The next is option swap. It is a combination of both swaps as well as option. It is hybrid in nature because it contains the special features of both option as well as swap. The next is callable, puttable and extendable swap. It is another kind of swap. It is basically related to the termination of a swap before, on and after maturity. If it is before, then it is called callable. On maturity, then it is puttable. And after maturity, it is extendable. The next which we are going to study now is the feature of a currency swap and its variants. Currency swaps. A currency swap is different from the interest rate swaps insofar as it involves two different currencies. Such two currencies are exchanged at two different times at beginning and maturity. A currency swap is different from interest rate swap in two ways. First, while interest rate swap involves any single currency, currency swap involves different currencies. And second, in interest rate swap, cash flows occurring on date are netted, but it is not in the case of currency swap. Very briefly, currency swap works like this. An Indian company, XYZ company, took an ECB, that is external commercial borrowing loan of USD 250 million for 6 years at a fixed interest rate of 5.5%. After 2 years, remaining time to maturity is 4 years. XYZ company wants to shift this USD obligation and wants to pay the interest and the principal in INR. The Indian company fears that INR to depreciate, hence increasing its INR expenditure to service the foreign currency denominated interest as well as principal. It approaches different banks for swapping its USD obligations. BBK Bank agrees to be the counterparty for the swap at an 8.5% per annum. Once both parties agree, the following swap payment happens between XYZ company and BBK Bank. In the beginning of the contract, XYZ company gives 250 million USD to BBK Bank. BBK Bank pays INR 11,750 million, which is equivalent of 250 million USD at a rate of INR 47 per USD to XYZ company. For the next 4 years, BBK Bank pays USD 13.75 million, which is 5.5% of USD 200 million to XYZ company. In return, XYZ company pays INR 998.75 million, which is 8.5% of INR 11,750 million to BBK Bank. After the 4th year, BBK Bank pays USD 250 million to XYZ company. XYZ company returns INR 11,750 million to BBK Bank. The following figure indicates the 3 steps in swap contract graphically. Hence, due to the swap agreement, the USD interest and principal repayment exposure of the Indian company is shifted to the BBK Bank. In other words, swap helped the Indian company to shift its USD obligation to INR obligation. Of course, one may ponder why BBK Bank would like to take such exposure. In fact, BBK Bank may not be taking the exposure at all, as BBK Bank may be exactly taking an opposite swap contract with some other counterparty. In the first swap agreement with Indian Bank, BBK Bank was paying USD and was receiving INR. BBK Bank can mitigate this risk by entering into a swap contract with another counterparty where it receives USD and pays INR. Of course, all swap contracts are not structured in a manner as given in figure 2. As swaps are OTC contracts, swaps can be structured in different formats. The swap contract can be used to only pay the interest payment only. In such types of swap, step 1 and step 3 are redundant. The swap contract can be used to cover the principal repayment and not the periodic interest payment. At times, the principal is swapped in 2 different currencies. The company may pay USD in step 1 and receive INR, and receive Euro in step 3 and pay INR. Depending upon the client's requirement, banks structure swaps with varying features. Variants of currency swaps. Like interest rate swap, currency swaps have the following forms: fixed for floating currency swaps, fixed for fixed currency swaps, floating for floating currency swaps, amortizing currency swaps. Difference between currency swap and interest rate swap. After analyzing the basic concept of interest rate swap and currency swap, there is also a need to understand the basic difference between these two. Currency swap involves the exchange of currency, whereas interest rate swap involves exchange of interest payments. Currency swap involves different set of currencies, basically more than one currency, while on the other hand, interest rate swap involves only any single currency but different set of interest rates. In the case of currency swap, principal and interest payments are exchanged without netting, but in the case of interest rate swap, payments that are exchanged are netted. The next which we are going to understand is the concept of pure swaps versus engineered swaps. A pure swap is a swap in which both the spot and forward transactions are done simultaneously with the same counterparty. On the other hand, an engineered swap is a swap in which both the spot and the forward transactions are done with different counterparties. In a pure swap, both legs of the swap are based on the same spot rate. In an engineered swap, because two legs of the swap are transacted with different counterparties, two deals will generally be based on different spot rates. Consequently, the calling bank or customer will normally find it more economical to enter into the pure swaps rather than the engineered swaps. For example, BID offers spot rates Australian dollar by US dollar 0.5200, 0.5205, 3-month swap rates 0.0024, 0.0021, 3 months forward rates, which is Australian dollar divided by US dollar is 0.5176 and 0.5184. A customer wants to buy A $1 lakh spot and sell A $1 lakh 3 months forward. So, the cost of swap as a pure and engineered shall be given in the following table. Therefore, it is clear that pure swap is actually more economical than that of engineered swap. This is because in the above example, the total cost of swap is less in case of pure swap. The next is the concept of equity swap. It is a special type of swap that are traded between the owner or shareholder of the company and the swap dealer. It originates from the payment of dividend to shareholder from the company and then exchange of such dividend with the swap dealer in terms of fixed or variable or vice versa. Basically, it involves the exchange of dividend. Normally, swap dealer pays a fixed rate of dividend to the shareholder. Equity swap is basically categorized into two parts: naked equity swap and covered equity swap. Naked equity swap is that swap where swap dealer does not pass the risk to equity shareholder, whereas in case of covered swap, he passes the risk to the shareholder. The risk arises through fluctuations in variable dividend will be borne by swap dealer only. He himself protects equity shareholder by paying them fixed dividend. But in case of covered equity swap, he gets an opportunity to hedge his position in dealing with the shareholder. It is possible only when shareholders are interested to receive high dividend even with the possibility of high risk. The next which we will study is the risk in swaps. First, interest rate risk. Such risk arises in the case of payment of fixed interest rate in lieu of floating interest rate. Fixed interest rate is more risky than floating interest rate because floating interest rates changes with the change of company profile over a period of time. This risk is generally borne by the swap dealer. The second is the exchange rate risk. Like interest rate risk, there is similar risk in case of fixed exchange rate. Such risk is also borne by swap dealer. Third, credit rate risk. It arises with the default payment made by the counterpart to swap dealer. In this case, contract become terminated by one party. Fourth, transfer risk. Transfer risk or delivery risk arises with the different time zone location of two counterparties so that the date of maturity differs by 1 day. Fortunately, swap dealer is less affected with the transfer risk. Fifth is mismatch risk. In order to find the match of counterparties' transaction, swap dealer has to give some offer to attract suitable counterparty. Such offer leads to cost for swap dealer. Sixth is sovereign risk. When there is political interference by the government of any one of the counterparty that may put some restriction on the flow of foreign exchange with other country. This may cause to restrict the payment of interest to the swap dealer. Let us now summarize what we have studied in this module. Swaps are private agreement between two parties to exchange cash flows in the future according to a pre-arranged formula. Generally, there are two types of swap, interest rate swap and currency swap. An interest rate swap is a contract which commits two counterparties to exchange over an agreed period two streams of interest payments, each calculated using a different interest rate index but applied to a common national principal amount. There are 5 variants of interest rate swaps, such as fixed for floating rate swaps, floating for floating rate swaps, fixed for fixed rate swaps, option swap, and callable, puttable, and extendable swap. A currency swap is different from the interest rate swap insofar as it involves two different currencies. Such two currencies are exchanged at two different times at the beginning and maturity. Similarly, there are also 4 variants of currency swaps, such as fixed for floating currency swaps, fixed for fixed currency swaps, floating for floating currency swaps, and amortizing currency swaps. A currency swap is different from interest rate swap in 2 ways. First, while interest rate swap involves any single currency, currency swap involves different currencies. Second, in interest rate swap, cash flows occurring on dates are netted, but this is not so in the case of currency swap. A pure swap is a swap in which both the spot and forward transactions are done simultaneously with the same counterparty. An engineered swap is a swap in which both the spot and forward transactions are done with different counterparties. Equity swap originates from the payment of dividend to the shareholder from the company and then exchange of such dividend with the swap dealer in terms of fixed to variable or vice versa. Basically, it involves the exchange of dividend. Interest rate risk arises in the case of payment of fixed interest rate in lieu of floating interest rate. Exchange rate risk, like interest rate risk, there is similar risk in case of fixed exchange rate. Credit rate risk arises with the default payment made by counterpart to swap dealer. In this case, contract become terminated by one party. Transfer risk delivery risk arises with the different time zone location of two counterparties so that the date of maturity differs by 1 day. Fortunately, swap dealer is less affected with the transfer risk. Mismatch risk arises with the need to find the match of counterparties' transaction. Swap dealer has to give some offer to attract suitable counterparty. Such offer leads to cost for swap dealer. Sovereign risk takes place when there is political interference by the government of any one of the counterparty that may put some restriction on the flow of foreign exchange with other country. This may cause to restrict the payment of interest to swap dealer.